For our interview today, I'll be asking a series of questions about your experience with disability activism in Utah. We have an hour for our interview, so please feel free to share stories in as much detail as you can remember. To get started, could you share your name and just a little bit about yourself?
My name is Sarah Johnson. I'm the board chair for Disabled Rights Action Committee.
Okay, how long have you been involved with disability activism in Utah?
That's a tricky question. In some ways, I've been involved my entire life. I was diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis when I was 18 months. Not too long after that, the governor's office asked me to come and be part of an awareness campaign for juvenile arthritis and children with disabilities. That was back when Governor Matheson was in the governor's mansion. Yes, Utah really did have a Democratic governor at one point in time. That was my first experience really being a part of disability awareness. And I've worked within that on and off my entire life. I have been a full-time disability advocate for the past 5 years and the board chair for Disabled Rights Action Company. And the board chair for Disabled Rights Action Committee for the past 3.
As someone who worked within the disability rights movement for quite a while, you've likely encountered a variety of different disability groups that have different approaches to social change. What can you remember about how and why you got involved with DRAC in the first place, and what made that group different?
You know, I actually became aware of DRAC through my Aunt Doris. In 1996, she suffered a stroke that left half of her body paralyzed. She quickly found Disabled Rights Action Committee, and with that group, really found a way to make meaningful change and use her disability as a strength and a way to inform the public around stroke issues. So it was Aunt Doris that got me involved in DRAC originally. She joined in the late 90s, I believe 96. She was on the board. And she's the one that really showed me what disability activism could be. At the time, I didn't realize I could be as involved as she was. They were doing all kinds of amazing activism, going on long rides. They would do wheelchair rides from Philadelphia to DC, kind of these marathon events. And I always wanted to be a part of that and never really felt that I could as a non-wheelchair user. I didn't realize at that time that I should have been advocating to get myself a wheelchair, that wheelchairs aren't only for people with paralysis, for people that need it long-term, permanently. Wheelchairs help us be more independent. They help conserve the bodies we have. My arthritis is a very debilitating disease that attacks my joints. You can think of inflammation as kind of like running a car without oil. When your joint is inflamed, you've got bone-on-bone rubbing. You don't have the necessary lubrication to protect that joint. I feel if I had had a wheelchair earlier in life, I maybe could have avoided some of the surgeries that I have had. And I look back and really wish that I had swallowed my pride, I think, a lot of my ableism and a lot of my pride, and just gotten a wheelchair earlier in life and owned more of my disability.
Do you have any memories of that time in the 90s when your Aunt Doris was working with DRAC? Did you show up to any events with her?
Yeah, I went to a few of their parties they'd have Christmas get-togethers, and I just remember what a family feel it was and how no matter what the disability was, everyone in the group seemed to at least understand each other. And that's something I've noticed in a lot of disability spaces. There's a lot of empathy that you don't see in the general population. And I think whatever the disability might be, it does give you a certain level of compassion and a certain level of insight into what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, to have something with your body that doesn't necessarily work in the normal way.
And do you have any sense of your Aunt Doris's personality and what she brought to the table?
Oh, she was a firecracker for sure. You could always tell my Aunt Doris because she had hats. And when I say hats, I mean hats. When we had her funeral, we put out all of her hats and allowed people to take them. My particular favorite was a large gold hat that was made of straw and kind of spiraled around her head and up into this grand crown. And that was just her way of getting recognized and getting noticed and demanding that people see her. With disabilities, the tendency seems to be this benign need to protect them from society. And we have such a stigma around disability and the idea that it's a negative thing. Doris wanted to make sure you saw her disability. She wanted to make sure that you understood there was nothing wrong with being disabled. It was just another step in life that could easily be lived through, lived with, and actually enjoyed.
Yeah. And for Doris, were there any issue areas that were especially important to her?
You know, independent housing was a very important thing for her. I actually remember even having arguments within the family when she wanted to move into a particular house, and we worried that she'd be too far away from us and from the family. But that's what her choice was. And she knew what she wanted, and she took that, even though, you know, it put her a little further away from us and it was harder to get out to her. You know, she really fought for what she wanted. She didn't want to be in a nursing home. She didn't want to have to rely on others. And right now, the way our system works, entirely too many disabled people are forced out of their homes. And Doris really proved that you could make things work. She was very inventive with the way she set up her house so that it worked specifically for her.
And during the era that you've been involved with DRAC and with disability activism in Utah, are there any events or issue areas that stand out as especially noteworthy or significant for you in your involvement?
That's a good question. Again, I think when I officially joined the organization, I saw that we were starting to change some of our focus. Previously, when we first started, of course, we were all about equal transportation and equal housing and accessibility at that base level of wheelchair access. And I think as we've continued to grow, we have really opened the door more to a number of different disabilities. We have a number of people on the neurodivergent spectrum, folks with autism. We've worked with the deaf community. We have worked with the blind visually impaired community. And I feel that we continue to learn more and more about disability and about access. It's not all cut and dry. It's not black and white. There is no one answer to the accessibility question. And that, more than anything, is what I think we're really trying to push, is this idea of very individualized, specific access for the individual.
And what has it been like to work with individuals with such a broad range of different disabilities? From your perspective, what is it that brings everyone together in this space?
For me, it's really exciting. Each person really does bring in their own definition of access and their own awareness. And daily, I feel completely ignorant of the possibilities that are out there. Every time I meet a new disabled individual, I find ways that they are making life work for them. We still live in a very ableist society. We do not have access. It is not easy to live with a disability in our society. But that's not our fault. That's not our disability. That's our society not opening their eyes and paying attention to what our society could be and how accessible we could be. So I love getting the chance to meet disabled people, see how they have coped with their disability, how they have adapted their lives, and how they've found success within their disability.
And do you have any stories about folks with different disabilities finding creative solutions to accessibility barriers in order to work together?
Absolutely. Obviously when we first started, you have heard about the bus crawl-ons. And I think people don't necessarily realize just how capable we are. Back in the 504 era, when we were fighting for 504, and they did the Capitol steps, they climbed the Capitol steps. We had full paraplegics crawling up those steps. I think it's nice to see that just because you're in a wheelchair doesn't mean you are wheelchair bound. I know for myself, I have a lot of ways that I adapt to things. Most people say I put my pants on one leg at a time. I like to say I put my pants on the same way as anyone, throw them up in the air and try to catch them on my feet, and then I wiggle my way in. So there's no one right way to do anything. And what you're going to find in the disability community are a number of different tools that people use. I carry a fondue fork with me to help me put my mask on and attach it behind my ears. So you'll frequently, if you go through a disabled person's bag or carry-all, you'll typically find a lot of really interesting ways that they've found to make things accessible for them.
That's really interesting. Do you have any other examples of creative accessibility hacks that you've seen in our community?
Let's see, what are some other accessibility hacks I have seen? I mean, I've seen so many, and I can't think of them now.
In this last year with COVID-19, we've had to come up with creative ways to make our online spaces accessible. We've had to come up with captioning. We've had to learn how to bring ASL interpreters into virtual meetings. All of that was from scratch. We didn't necessarily have those things in place before.
Well, and what COVID-19 really did for the disabled community is showed the world that the accommodations we have been requesting for the past 30 years and longer really are not unreasonable. We have shown the world that it is possible to allow us to telecommute. It is possible to allow us to have these telehealth visits, these telemeetings. We don't necessarily have to report to the office to still be an part of the workday. We can still be very productive while conserving our bodies and taking care of our needs from home.
Yeah. And with COVID, can you think of anything that has changed within the movement here in Utah that stands out to you as noteworthy?
Again, I think the biggest thing is the change we've seen in digital accessibility. In addition, I believe a lot of people, as they have contracted COVID, have begun to realize what it might be to have health concerns. Nobody really understands what it's like to live with a disability until they're faced with it themselves. I think part of the problem is in not showing disability, I think we create a lot of fear and stigma. And once people go through that themselves, they really do discover they're more resilient than they think they are. So we are seeing people, unfortunately, coming down with COVID and ending up with long-term health conditions as a result. But these people are also seeing that there is a way through that. And I think a lot of disability groups right now are helping people to cope with that transition.
Yeah. Have disability groups been playing any other role this last year in COVID in providing services or connecting people with resources?
Absolutely. And Disabled Rights Action Committee ourselves was really lucky that we received a number of grants to help ensure we got PPE out to vulnerable populations. So we were distributing masks, we were distributing hand sanitizers, we were ensuring that disabled populations had the safety equipment they needed to keep safe during COVID. And when COVID first hit, some of the first people to stand forward and offer help on how to transition were the disabled communities. Many of us have had to quarantine because of our own autoimmune disorders anyways. So for a lot of us, nothing really changed with COVID. Many of us were familiar with masking up during flu season. Many of us were familiar with how to quarantine at home and how to keep a sterile environment and a sanitary environment around us. So in that way, we really did help show the rest of society how to go about doing that.
And then looking back a little ways, I've got a big question for you. I know we've come a long way since the passage of the ADA in 1990. In the time that you've been working on disability issues here in Utah, how have you seen that landscape evolve? What has changed since 1990?
You know, it's interesting. I was born in the 70s. I went to school pre-ADA. And my mother, who is an incredible woman, had to fight for every last accommodation I was given. I remember in elementary school, the teachers didn't want to give me a second set of books that I could keep at home. You know, you'd have to carry your big book bag back and forth to school. My mother went in and just asked if we could have a spare set to keep at home so that I didn't have that weight on my back. I didn't have that wear and tear on my joints. Again, we're talking about joint conservation, and that excess weight was really damaging to my joints. My teachers felt that that would be unfair to the other students if I was given my own set of books to keep at home. And my mom, Julie Mayhew, had to fight tooth and nail just to get that one accommodation. So I am encouraged by the fact that we have individualized education plans. I am encouraged by the fact that when you go in and take a job, you do have recourse with human resources to ask for the accommodations you need. Unfortunately, we still have a lot of people that don't see the need for those accommodations, but we at least at this point now have a law that says, whether you agree or not, you have to do this for me. When I was growing up, we didn't have that protection.
And we've talked about the work that DRAC and other disability activists were involved in making transportation accessible here in Utah with the crawl-ons and the bus blockades. Since that time, how have you seen those issues shift? What other issues are on the table since that time?
You know, it's interesting. Most recently, I have seen that a lot of the environmental movements are starting to realize how important outdoor spaces are for disabled folks. In the past, the idea has always been that, you know, outdoor recreation was for the abled. And if you were disabled, there was really no space for you. We are starting to see a strong push toward full accessibility in all aspects of life, whether that be skydiving or getting on a bus. So we are seeing hiking trails that are made wheelchair accessible. We are seeing ways to get up to the ski resorts for people with disabilities. And I think that's a really important thing for people to be able to get out and be active. Just because you're disabled doesn't mean you're not capable of being very physically involved in your environment. Doesn't mean you should be denied access to our amazing natural surroundings, Zion National Park and Bryce Canyon. We need to make sure that we have full access on all aspects of society, and environmental groups are starting very slowly to wake up to that idea.
And thinking about other issues that DRAC has been involved in over the years, can you speak to community-based care and the work DRAC has done on deinstitutionalization?
Deinstitutionalization is a very important topic, and the institutionalization of disabled people has for decades, centuries, been a horrible, horrible situation. I think when you get right down to it, it's society's lack of willingness just to be patient. It is possible to maintain a home while you're disabled. It is possible to raise a family while you're disabled. You know, later in life, my Aunt Doris actually went back to Ghana. She had been in the Peace Corps earlier in her life. And one of the last things she did before she passed was return to Ghana and help them set up a disabled rights organization there. And what was remarkable about that time she spent in Africa, back with friends, people that she knew, is how far out of the way they went to ensure that she had access in a country that did not have the infrastructure to really accommodate a power chair. But the way that they went out of their way to help her, and just this spirit that we want to ensure you can enjoy what we're enjoying, I think that's something we lack in America. And I think in a lot of other cultures, you see this willingness to help each other. That doesn't always work out so well in a capitalist-based system when we're worried about the bottom line, when we're worried about what it's going to cost to keep somebody in their own home. And the fact of the matter is we have plenty of resources out there to ensure that an individual can stay in their home and still get the community-based care they need, have people coming in and checking on them, helping them with the daily activities of bathing, grooming, those kinds of things. And my Aunt Doris was proof of that.
I know that accessible, affordable housing has also been a priority for disability rights activists in Utah. Can you speak a little bit to the work that's been done in that area?
It is an ongoing struggle, and it's frustrating to me to see the rising trend with townhome construction. Townhome construction is one way that a lot of architects are getting around the ADA and not necessarily having to make spaces that are accessible. One of the big issues in accessible housing is the idea of visitability. You may not necessarily have a disability yourself, but your home should be visitable by somebody with a disability. I know many people, not necessarily just folks in wheelchairs, that struggle to get into their families' homes, that struggle at Christmas, at Thanksgiving, when the family wants to get together and have a movie night in the basement. The idea of visitability is that the main areas of your house are accessible to people with disabilities, that you have a zero-step entrance, that you have a main floor bathroom, things like this. And a lot of housing advocates are really starting to address that issue of visitability. Again, it works out as we age too. More and more people are starting to see as they age that they do need those adaptations. And if we build it into the system now, they're not going to struggle when they make that transition to disabled.
And based on what we've talked about the changing landscape for disability advocacy here in Utah, what important issues are unresolved and what issues are most pressing today?
I think one of the most pressing issues we're facing right now is just visibility. I think the media is complicit in keeping disabled folks oppressed, keeping them stigmatized, and keeping them out of the public eye. Again, there's this benevolent feeling that we need to protect people, disabled folks, from society. When I was in junior high school, I auditioned for the part of Dr. Einstein in the play Arsenic and Old Lace. I was not given the part, and when my mother pressed and asked why, she was told by my drama teacher that she just couldn't stand the thought of little Sarah being laughed at. That is a problem. That is a problem when we won't allow disabled folks to be seen, to be treated as human beings. I had auditioned for a humorous part. I was anticipating being laughed at, and she denied me that opportunity because she felt she had to protect me. The media needs to start telling stories. The media has got to start saying the word disabled. The media has got to start showing disabled actors telling disabled stories.
Absolutely. And taking kind of another topic, I want to kind of go back in time just a little bit. What can you remember about our founder, Barbara Toomer? And do you have any stories you can share that might illustrate what she was like as a leader in Utah's disability politics?
You know, I wish I had known Barbara Toomer longer than I did. Barbara Toomer makes an impression. And from the moment I met her, I knew I was dealing with a force. I had run into her at the parties and things like that. And it was years later that I ran into her again at the Democratic State Convention. I remember her rolling into the Disability Caucus room and everyone deferring to her opinion. I remember people just lighting up when she was around. I remember there were a lot of contentious moments in drag. We have a lot of different strong personalities. And there would be times when somebody felt a certain issue wasn't getting enough attention, or we weren't going about it in the right way. And Barbara could be very strong-willed and opinionated about that, but she always made sure that she respected the individual, and she always allowed that individual to voice their frustration. She allowed anger in the movement, and I think that's something that's really important in disability, is that ability to vent your frustration and get through that. Barbara had a really great way of allowing people, of venting her own frustrations, but allowing others to vent theirs too. And over the years, we've seen a number of members come and go. We've seen members flame out spectacularly and quit the group, but come back in months or years later to get involved again. And I think that really speaks to Barbara's acceptance and her ability to love and understand everyone on their level, knowing where their trauma came from, honoring their trauma, and helping them work through that trauma.
And do you know if your Aunt Doris and Barbara were good friends?
Yes, my Aunt Doris very much respected Barbara Toomer. And I know that my Aunt Doris was a very respected part of drag. Again, it's one of my biggest regrets that I did not get more involved in that organization when I was much younger. But I wasted a lot of time just trying to live in an ableist society and denied my disability. I think drag, more than anything, is an organization that encourages people to embrace their disability, to admit they are disabled, and to celebrate that.
Yeah. And you spoke previously about your experiences with inaccessibility as a student in the 70s and 80s. Can you think of any other experiences you've had with inaccessibility that a student or a child wouldn't have today? Things that have changed because of the work of groups like DRAC.
Right. When I was in elementary school, I was put into high reading in 5th grade. But the classroom for the high reading kids was on another side of the building that required you to go down one flight of stairs and up another. The accommodation at the time was to put me back in low reading because that's the classroom that was accessible to me. So these are things that shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be forcing kids into a lower subject matter because of a physical barrier. That was the wrong answer at the time. It's the wrong answer still. Sadly, we do still see inaccessible schools, but we have the tools now to fight that. Now, should that same situation happen, that teacher would be required to move to an accessible room to accommodate a student. The student would not need to be the one to make the accommodation.
And as a power chair user yourself, how is your life different today, 31 years after the passage of the ADA, than it would have been previously?
It's given me a legal standing to fight. I think growing up, the only reason I had the accessible options that I did is because I had a very powerful mother that fought for those things. Sadly, a lot of disabled folks don't have that kind of advocate, or they don't have that strength within themselves. My mother gave me my strength. My mother taught me how to fight for myself. And my mother never acted like it was a tragedy in her life to have a disabled child. I think the ADA really helps current disabled folks fight for those things. It gives them strength. It reminds them that they do belong, that they do have a right to fight for their equal access.
And today in 2021, where do you see the disability rights movement headed, both nationally and here in Utah?
We are starting to see a lot more intersectionality come into play. Previously, much of the movement was very white, patriarchal, and tended to focus, again, on certain forms of disabilities over others. We're seeing that evening out a lot. We're starting to see how disability changes for those in the BIPOC population, those who are part of the LGBTQIA community, how trans health can affect disability, and how sometimes if you have a disability and are trans and taking estrogen, that can interact with the therapies you're taking for your disability. So there is a lot of awareness about individualized, marginalized situations and how complex those situations can get. We're seeing that there is no one-size-fits-all model. It's not okay to just have a handicap parking stall out front and a ramp into your building. That's not what makes you accessible. We need to make sure that environments are safe for people with sensory disabilities. We need to make sure that environments are not overly stimulating for those on the neurodivergent spectrum. So we are looking at disability and access from a much larger perspective and fine-tuning it.
And in addition to thinking about accessibility more broadly, the ways that activists do their work has also changed over the years. We're no longer just knocking on doors, we're also creating Facebook events and trying to mobilize people online. How could you speak to that shift and how activism looks given social media in the 21st century?
I think there will always be a place for the door knockers. There will always be a place for direct action, and there will always be a place for that extreme activism that Barbara Toomer always went for. But it is nice to know that we can still be active from our beds on the days when we're flaring. We can still be a part of the community. I have disability advocates across the country that I communicate with on a regular basis. Many of these people in the past would have been considered non-communicative. These are people that can't take part in the disability conversation. And we saw this in the movie Crip Camp that was recently nominated for an Oscar. And we see this in the work going on online, that there are ways for people to communicate, even if they are nonverbal, even if they have some form of developmental delay. We just have to be patient. We just have to look at other ways of communicating. Language alone is not the only way that we communicate. And it's exciting to see the different ways disabled folks can tell their stories and how technology is helping us tell those stories.
And 31 years after the passage of the ADA, do you think that awareness of accessibility as an issue has changed much, if at all?
It's disappointing to me, honestly, how few people are even aware of the ADA, and that you can say the ADA and people will ask what the acronym means. Again, I think this is largely the media's fault. I think as a society, we have not done an ample job educating the public about disability issues. So for me, no, I'm not happy with where we are with the ADA. And I won't be until we start seeing disabled faces telling disabled stories and seeing a societal shift. I get pretty obnoxious at parties because I can tie absolutely anything back to a disability issue. And I want that to be the case. I want every news story to mention how it affects the disability community. I want every every event that's planned, I want to see an accessibility plan. Every building, I want to know that they have posted where their accessible routes are. There are many businesses around town that are accessible that I've never been to because they hide their access points. So until we start fully displaying what access looks like, we have not honored the ADA.
And are there any other topics that we haven't touched on today, but that you would like to speak about? And do you have any memorable stories to share?
Well, I guess I could tell the story of my first arrest. So DRAC is involved in direct action, and we will go out in the community, and when we see a problem, occupy offices. During this past administration, we saw Obamacare under threat, and our people made regular trips to DC. We would blockade certain senators' offices, and we wouldn't leave until they agreed to a meeting. In many cases, those senators never agreed. And one of the offices that we did blockade, they ended up calling in the police and arresting our members that refused to leave the office. I remember after my first arrest, the feeling of camaraderie. And the day of my arrest, there was actually a horrible windstorm going on in Washington, D.C. with typhoon-level winds. By the time I got processed and out of jail, the rain was coming down very hard. But my family had waited for me. My DRAC community was standing outside of the building in the pouring rain, waiting for me to be released. We managed to make it back to the hotel, but we were soaked through to the bone. I have never been as wet as I was at that time, but I've also never been as happy and never felt as included in something important. And because of those visits to DC, we managed to maintain the integrity of the ACA. We managed to maintain coverage for people with pre-existing conditions.
Do you have any other stories from actions that stand out in your mind?
Well, let's talk again about Barbara and what an indomitable force she was. Back in the summer of 2017, we blocked State Street as a way to gain Senator Orrin Hatch's attention. At the time, he was being very dismissive of the disabled rights community and our pleas to protect the ACA. We managed to get a large group together and blocked State Street right in front of his office. And there's an amazing picture of Barbara in her wheelchair with a car trying to barrel through, and she doesn't budge. She didn't even flinch. And that's the kind of steadfast courage she had. You could be coming at her in a car and she's not going to get out of the way. And because of that, Utah has one of the most accessible public transportation systems in the country. it does take people like Barbara, it does take that direct action to finally make the critical change.
Okay, do you have any final thoughts?
Woohoo!
Thank you so much for your participation.
Yeah. Go disability.